I'm not sure what you think when you hear the name Mary Magdalene. Maybe you're not sure. Maybe you think of Mary Magdalene as one of the women present at Jesus' crucifixion and also at his resurrection, particularly as it is described in the Gospel of John, when she alone arrives to find the tomb empty and then mistakes the risen Christ for a gardener. Maybe you think of Mary Magdalene as a tainted sinner, a repentant prostitute, healed from demons but never really able to shed the reputation that came with the long-established connection, true or not, between those things. Maybe you think of more modern fictional writings that have connected Mary Magdalene to Jesus in more intimate ways, as a wife or a partner. Art over time has depicted Mary Magdalene in a variety of ways. I will share just two examples by Georges de la Tour in the 17th century, depicting Mary as pensive and reflective, hidden yet exposed, a little dark, a little suggestive. Mary Magdalene has been many things over many centuries to many people. Her reputation has developed very differently in the Eastern Church than in the Western tradition, based both on her presence in the Scriptures and other non-canonical texts, meaning writings that didn't make it into the Bible that we have today, and also based on the way that her story has been interpreted over time. In the Eastern Church tradition, Mary Magdalene has been understood to have held certain special knowledge because of her relationship with Jesus. This is a common understanding in some Gnostic texts, which are other written accounts of the life and sayings of Jesus. Some of these writings, called the Nag Hammadi texts, are likely from the same time period as the gospel texts that we know best, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written at the end of the first or maybe beginning of the second centuries. Texts that you may not be familiar with, like the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, and actually a Gospel of Mary, describe Mary Magdalene's close relationship with Jesus and how she was involved in leadership of the early disciples, which may have led to conflict with Peter and other male disciples who were also early leaders. I guess conflict between people, particularly people vying for leadership positions, is not new. In the Western Christian tradition, with which we tend to be more familiar, Mary Magdalene's character has taken on a much different tone. Last week, we talked about a different Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who is depicted in the Gospel of John as having washed Jesus' feet with extremely expensive perfume and drying his feet with her hair, an act of extravagance and abundant generosity and love. I mentioned then, and we heard read, 4 versions of that story from each of the 4 Gospels, including a version that is found at the very end of Luke chapter 7. That version portrays an unnamed woman, characterized specifically as a sinner, washing Jesus' feet first with her tears and then with perfumed ointment. The focus is on the woman's attention to Jesus when the host, Simon, did not attend, and Jesus' lavish forgiveness of her sins interlaced with the woman's lavish love and care. But Simon, and many readers since, focus most on the woman's status in that story as sinner. The 7 demons that were thrown out of Mary Magdalene, as we hear in Luke 8, could allude to a variety of physical or spiritual ailments. There is nothing that ties this story of the sinner to Mary Magdalene, except for the fact that it occurs immediately before the naming of Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna at the beginning of Luke 8. Well, that and Pope Gregory. In about the year 590, Pope Gregory preached to a group of brothers, likely a monastic community of men, and not only identified the woman sinner in the story of the washing of Jesus' feet as a tarnished, repentant Mary, but suggested heavily that she had been using the perfume to cover up, quote, forbidden acts of the flesh that she had displayed scandalously. This theme has led to centuries of confusion about which Mary is which, and are they the same, and are all the women that are not named also Mary? But it has also led to centuries of degradation of Mary Magdalene's character, which, whether intentional or not, tends to rub off on perceptions of many women, both in Scripture and outside of Scripture, particularly those with, quote, questionable relationship status or history, and sometimes suggests moral and intellectual deficiencies of women. And yet, although these 3 verses at the beginning of Luke chapter 8, where Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna are named, certainly do not tell us all that we want to know about Mary Magdalene, they do quite clearly identify these 3 women as not only accompanying Jesus and the 12 male disciples, but also they are providing for them out of their resources, indicating that Mary, Joanna, and Susanna were women who were investing both time and likely finances into this teacher and this movement. These are women of means, women with will, women with power. There's another thing that I find very interesting about Mary Magdalene. Her name, at least the Magdalene part, has traditionally been understood as a reference to a town, Magdala, from where she originated. It is very possible that this is the case, but there might be more to understand about her name. Biblical scholar Joan E. Taylor investigated the archaeological and historical evidence of various towns and villages in the area where Jesus is thought to have lived and taught and traveled. And to spare you the effort of reading the 19-page article, I'll tell you the essence. It is quite likely that there was no specific town at that time called Magdala or similar, which would have necessarily made sense as a hometown reference for this Mary. The word Magdal in Aramaic or Migdal in Hebrew means tower. And while there were several villages with that word as part of their name, they are, in English, names like Migdal Nunia or Tower of Fish. They would have been Tower of something and would have been unlikely to have just been Migdal or Tower as a reference that made sense to people further away. It would have been like me saying I'm from the county, which might make sense to us here, but wouldn't make much sense if I traveled to visit someone in another area of Pennsylvania or elsewhere. Instead, Taylor argues, it is possible that Mary was called Magdalene not because she was from a place called Magdala or similar, but because she was being called a nickname, like Mary the Toweress. The way Luke identifies her at the beginning of chapter 8 is literally translated from the Greek as Maria called Magdalene. And later in chapter 24, which also was read by Ray, her name is literally translated as the Magdalene Maria. Luke's language for her being called, the Greek verb kaleo, follows the pattern of other disciples who were given special nicknames by Jesus, like Simon, the zealous one, Judas, called Iscariot, which is from an Aramaic word meaning choked up, Simon, called Peter, which we may recognize as the Greek for rock. These nicknames given by Jesus would have also helped distinguish between multiple people with the same name, Simon, Judas, John, and we know there were several Marys. This Mary had a special relationship with Jesus. Whether she was from a place called Magdala or whether she was given a name to signify her importance in the early followers of Jesus, she was a disciple of Jesus, not only as a follower, but one who had received healing and was able and willing to give back to help further his ministry. And she became one of the first, if not the first, witness to his resurrection in all four Gospels in the New Testament. She was really the first to see and share the good news of Jesus' transformation. She experienced Jesus' transformative love. She herself was transformed. No matter how you view her character, she played a towering role in the early Christian narrative. I wonder what Mary would think or feel about the way that her character has been interpreted across time. There is much we don't know. And I suppose that is the most important thing that I carry now about Mary Magdalene. We so very much want to fill in the gaps about her life. It is so much easier to make sense of Jesus' teachings when we can better understand those who were around him. Living with the tension of interpretation and lack of details is frustrating. But what we have is one named identification of Mary Magdalene with Joanna and Susanna in Luke 8, and 4 gospel accounts that place her at both the cross and the resurrection. Those are really important. But we don't have the full story. Not only about Mary Magdalene, but about pretty much every person we encounter, both in Scripture and in life. I remember many years ago in one of my earliest jobs, before I'd even graduated from college, being told by a coworker in a team meeting that they didn't think I was pulling my weight and appropriately prioritizing my share of work shifts. Those comments deeply cut into my perception of who I was, and it was painful. I can still feel it resonating a bit in my soul. That moment has forever shaped the way I view myself in work environments, the way I take critique, the way I view or try not to view others. We never fully know what is going on behind the scenes of the way people present to us, do we? Even those with whom we share much time and close relationship. And so we are invited closer. As Jesus invited his disciples close, we too are invited closer, closer to each other, closer to God. This is the commonality across all 3 Marys with whom we have sat these past 3 weeks. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who washed Jesus' feet in expensive perfume, and Mary the Magdalene. They all had close relationship, intimate moments and experiences with Jesus that no one else shared. And we are invited into this relationship as well. Spiritual attentiveness to the sacred breath of God and to the presence of Jesus that is found in shared moments of authentic relationship with each other. May it be so.